Melitene, April 19th of the year 303 AD. The morning still carries the chill of the night as footsteps echo in the stone corridor. They are heavy, calculated steps, the kind of step that announces something is about to change. The door to the main hall opens with a dry sound, and the grey light of dawn enters, along with 4 men dressed in the colours of imperial power, dark red and worn gold. In the centre of the room standing is the commander. He didn't move when he heard the footsteps. He didn't recoil when the door opened. He stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, his clean armour reflecting the faint flames of the torches on the wall, his eyes fixed on the 4 men who now stood before him as if they were a wall. One of them opens a scroll, a document bearing the emperor's seal, that symbol which the entire Roman world recognizes as the voice of absolute power. The voice that read the document is cold, unhurried, like someone repeating something already said many times that month, that year, in many different cities. You will renounce the God of the Christians. You will make sacrifices to the gods of Rome. You will reaffirm your loyalty to the emperor. 3 sentences, 3 demands, 1 choice. Behind the commander, leaning against the opposite wall, are 5 men. Also soldiers, also in armor, also standing, also. They weren't called to this meeting. They came of their own accord. Because when the commander was summoned, they looked at each other and decided, without needing to speak, that they wouldn't be left out. The silence that settles in is as thick as the air before a storm. The imperial officers wait. The torches crackle. Outside, through the narrow window overlooking the barracks courtyard, the sounds of waking soldiers begin to be heard. The familiar noise of a new day that doesn't yet know that this will not be an ordinary day. The commander takes a deep breath, once, slowly, and then he speaks. He doesn't shout, he doesn't give speeches, he doesn't tremble. His voice comes out firm, clear, from the same place where the battle orders came, which 6,800 men obeyed without question. No. 1 word. 7 letters in Latin that at that moment were worth more than everything he had built in 30 years of military life, more than his position, more than his glory, more than his own life. The 5 men behind him, without coordinating, respond with the same firm silence. They don't need to speak. They've already said everything there is to say. The imperial officer slowly rolls up the scroll, looks at the commander one last time, and leaves. This man's name was Expedito, and that wasn't the moment he lost everything. It was the moment he gained the only title that no emperor could give or take away. To understand who Expedito was, you first need to understand where he was born. Melitene was no ordinary city. It was a living fortress, nestled in the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire, in what we now call Turkey, on the border with Armenia. Imagine a place where the wind descends from the mountains smelling of snow even in summer, where the Euphrates River begins to gain strength before flowing south, where the horizon is always a line of mountains covered in bluish mist. That was where the Roman Empire ended, and that was where everything else began. Armenia, the region encompassing Melitene and extending beyond the mountains, was a land of very ancient history, long before the Romans arrived. Christians knew this name well. According to the book of Genesis, it was on the mountains of Ararat, in the heart of Armenia, that Noah's Ark landed when the waters of the Great Flood receded. It was a land touched by faith since the dawn of humanity. Centuries later, the apostles Judas, Thaddeus, Simon, and Bartholomew had traveled those same stone roads, preaching in villages that barely had names on the Roman map. The seeds of Christianity were planted there early, in hard soil, among a people who knew the weight of persecution and the harshness of survival. It was in this world that Expedito grew up. From the Roman perspective, Melitene was a crucial strategic outpost, one of the empire's gateways to the east. Whoever controlled Melitene controlled the route to Persia, to the steppe peoples, and to the trade routes that supplied Rome with silk, spices, and gold. Therefore, the city lived in a permanent state of military readiness. Men learned to walk before they learned to fight, and they learned to fight before they learned anything else. Life in Melitene had a particular rhythm. At dawn, the clanging of metal armor. At midday, the smell of baking bread and sun-dried leather. In the afternoon, the dust kicked up by the horses in the training field. At night, the fire of the campfires and the stories of the veterans who had seen the world beyond the mountains. It was within this rhythm that Expedito's character was formed. Discipline entered him as it does every son of a fortified city, not as an imposed rule, but as second nature. Readiness, the ability to act immediately without hesitation, was the highest value in that environment. A soldier who hesitates dies. A commander who hesitates loses battles. This harsh land produced a tough man, efficient, direct, quick. The Romans, who had a habit of giving nicknames that described a person's character, called this man Expedito, which in Latin means exactly that. One who acts without delay, without hindrance, without postponement. He didn't yet know that this name would one day describe not only how he fought, but how he loved God. Reaching command of a Roman legion was not a matter of luck or family ties. It was a matter of proving, year after year, battle after battle, that no other man could do the job better. Expedito proved it. The 12th Legion, known as the Fulminating Legion, whose symbol was a lightning bolt, was based in Melitene and was responsible for defending the entire eastern border of the Roman Empire against attacks from barbarian peoples coming from the east. With more than 6,800 men, including soldiers, cavalry, and auxiliaries, it was one of the largest and most respected military forces in the known world. Commanding this troop was equivalent in modern times to the rank of general of an entire army. Expedito reached that position between the years 296 and 333 AD. He had arrived there because he was precise in everything he did, in tactical movements, in camp discipline, in the way he treated the men. He was the type of commander that soldiers respected not out of fear, but because they knew he would never send them into a battle he didn't understand. And like every high-ranking Roman official, Expedito lived according to what his position allowed and demanded. The life of a Roman commander was made up of banquets where wine flowed endlessly, of feasts in honor of the empire's gods, of relationships based on power and influence. Luxury was a language. To demonstrate wealth was to demonstrate strength. An austere commander would be seen as weak. A commander generous with pleasures would be seen as someone who understood the rules of the game. Expedito played this game very well. He was not a cruel or dishonest man by the standards of his time. He was a man of his world, shaped by the values of that world. Military glory, loyalty to the empire, power won with blood and dedication. The idea that there was something above the emperor, something that deserved even greater loyalty, simply did not fit within the limits of the horizon he had built for himself. But there was something about that legion that Expedito saw every day and couldn't explain. Among his 6,800 men, there was a group that behaved differently. They were no less disciplined or less courageous. They were often the best soldiers he had. But there was something in the way they prepared for battle, in the way they buried their dead, in the way they treated the wounded on the enemy side, that Expedito observed with a mixture of curiosity and unease. These men prayed to a God who had died on a cross and, according to them, had returned to life. Expedito didn't understand that, but without realizing it, he was beginning to pay attention. To understand what would happen to Expedito, we need to go back more than 100 years before him. It was the year 173 AD, and Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the man who ruled Rome at that time, and who was considered one of the greatest philosophers of the ancient world, found himself in a desperate situation. His army was surrounded by the Hodie, a barbarian people who inhabited the region we now call Slovakia. The summer was scorching, provisions had run out, and what was most urgently needed was water. The soldiers, exhausted and thirsty, looked to the horizon and saw no way out. It was then that something happened that none of those present ever forgot. Among the soldiers in Marcus Aurelius's army was an entire troop made up mostly of Christians, the 12th Legion, based in Melitene. These soldiers stepped away from the field, knelt on the dry ground, and began to pray. There was nothing extraordinary about the scene. Men bent over, heads bowed, lips moving in silence, and then the sky changed. A heavy rain fell on the Roman soldiers, refreshing the men and filling their vessels. At the same time, a storm of lightning and hail struck the enemy army, with such violence that the Hodie scattered in panic. The battle that seemed lost turned into victory without a single sword being needed. Marcus Aurelius was so impressed that he gave that troop a special nickname, fulminating, meaning the one that brings lightning. The event was recorded in Roman and Christian sources, including writings preserved by the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the first great chroniclers of the Church. The Roman Senate even ordered a column to be erected in honor of the feat, although each side attributed the miracle to a different god. This was the legion that Expedito commanded. Do you know someone who is going through a situation that seems hopeless? Sometimes the solution comes from where you least expect it, but the story of faith in that troop didn't end with the miracle of the rain. 110 years later, in the year 193, a soldier from the same 12th Legion, named Polyeuctus, born in Melitene, was arrested for refusing to deny his Christian faith. Faced with his interrogators, Polyeuctus did not back down. He gave his life for Christ with the same tranquility with which he would have carried out a battle order. His name remained in the memory of that troop like a silent treasure. Expedito entered as commander of a legion that had witnessed miraculous rain fall from the sky. That had produced a martyr. That carried in its history the memory of men who believed in something greater than the glory of Rome. The seed was planted deep in the ground of that troop. Expedito didn't yet know that he was about to be harvested. There comes a point in some people's lives when they stop seeing and begin to observe. The object hasn't changed. It's the perspective that's different. For Expedito, that moment arrived on an ordinary morning of patrol. It was before dawn. The sky was still dark over the mountains when the group of soldiers left the barracks toward the eastern borders. The cold bit their fingers through their leather gloves, and the horse's breath formed white clouds in the still air. It was a routine outing, reconnaissance, checking positions, the invisible work that sustained the entire empire. Expedito was in the middle of the formation when he realized that the men in front of him had stopped. It wasn't a warning stop. There was no sign of danger. It was a voluntary, silent pause. 3 Christian soldiers from the troop had dismounted and knelt on the icy roadside, heads bowed and lips moving in prayer before setting off for the day's work. 2 other horsemen waited impatiently, as if it were as natural as sharpening a sword. Expedito watched them for a long moment before signaling for them to continue. He said nothing, but he didn't forget. In the following weeks, he began to notice what had always been before his eyes. The Christian soldiers of the Legion carried something he couldn't name. It wasn't an absence of fear. He had seen these men in battles and they fought as bravely as anyone else. It was something different from fear. It was as if they knew, even in the most difficult situations, that they were not alone. There was an older soldier named Hermogenes, whom Expedito began to observe with particular attention. Hermogenes' face was marked by decades of campaigning, his hands calloused from holding shields and spears, and he possessed a serenity in his gaze that seemed out of place for his profession. When the wounded arrived at camp after a battle, Hermogenes was always one of the first to appear, not by order, but by choice. He cared for others without expecting recognition, without asking for anything in return. One afternoon, Expedito stopped near him while he was tending to a wounded companion and asked, with the directness of someone who has no patience for beating around the bush, "Why do you do this?" Hermogenes looked up and replied simply, "Because Christ did it for me first." Expedito didn't answer. He turned and left. But the phrase stayed. It settled somewhere inside him like a small stone in a shoe, not unbearable, but impossible to ignore. He returned to it at night, when the camp slept and only the mountain wind made noise. He returned to it in the following days, during the long, silent marches. Something had begun to stir within that hard man from Melitene. He still didn't know the name of what he was feeling, but he was about to find out. Tradition holds that the decision came suddenly, like the rain that had saved that same legion more than 100 years before. Expedito was alone when he felt what the Christians around him described as the grace of God, a sudden clarity, a certainty that didn't come from reasoning, but from a place deeper than reasoning can reach. After months of observing, questioning, resisting, everything became simple. He wanted what Hermogenes had, that peace, that certainty, that presence that didn't depend on victories or positions. He wanted Christ, and it was precisely at that moment, tradition is accurate here, that a voice began to speak within him. Not now, later, when things are calmer, when the time is right. Tomorrow is better. Tomorrow. In Latin, the word for tomorrow is cros, and tradition says that this voice sounded like a raven, the bird that in ancient cultures was associated with postponement, procrastination, the spirit that always finds a reason not to act today. Cross, tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Expedito recognized that voice. It was the same one he had been fighting within himself for months, the voice of comfort, of hesitation, of what if. And with the same instinct of a commander that had led him to the highest rank in that troop, he made a decision. He stepped on the crow. He shouted inwardly with all the conviction he possessed, "Hodie, today, not tomorrow. Not when conditions are perfect. Not when the risk decreases. Today." Expedito converted to Christianity that very day, and he immediately began speaking about his faith to the men he commanded, because that was how he did everything, without hesitation, without half measures. Several soldiers of the 12th Legion, touched by the commander's own testimony, also converted. Here's something worth understanding. The Catholic Church has taught for centuries that the time to convert, to ask for forgiveness, to act for good, is never tomorrow. It's always today. This isn't a rule invented by theologians in closed rooms. It's a truth that a Roman soldier from Melitene lived with his own body, trod with his own foot, and shouted with his own voice. Every time a Catholic goes to confession without delay, every time someone decides today and not tomorrow, they are unknowingly repeating Expedito's gesture. The word Hodie is still imprinted on the image known throughout the world, the Roman soldier standing, with the cross in his right hand, and the word engraved in clear letters, stepping on the raven that caws in vain. 2,000 years of history, and the raven still croaks. And the answer remains the same, today. During the early years of his reign, Emperor Diocletian, the man who ruled the largest empire in the known world, with power over dozens of provinces, hundreds of cities, and millions of people, had surprised Christians with his tolerance. There were Christians in his own palace. His wife Prisca and his daughter Valeria were sympathetic to Christianity, possibly already baptized. Christians held important positions in the administration and the army, as was the case with Expedito and dozens of other officers in the eastern provinces. For a time it seemed that the era of great persecutions had been left behind. It seemed so. In the year 33 AD, something changed. Historians point to the growing influence of Galerius, Diocletian's son-in-law, responsible for the eastern provinces of the empire, a man who saw Christianity not as a religion, but as a political threat. For Galerius, a soldier who placed loyalty to Christ above loyalty to the emperor, was a soldier who could not be trusted. Diocletian yielded to the pressure. In February of the year 333, the first decrees were issued, imperial orders with the weight of absolute law. They were direct and brutal orders. Churches would be destroyed, sacred books would be burned, Christian assemblies would be prohibited. Every Christian in a position of authority, military, civil, or administrative, would be obliged to make a public sacrifice to the Roman gods as proof of loyalty to the emperor. Anyone who refused would lose their job. Anyone who insisted on refusing would pay with their freedom. Anyone who persisted would pay with their life. The painful irony was evident to anyone paying attention. The very emperor who signed these decrees had a wife and daughter in his palace who prayed to the same god he now ordered to be denied. History records that Prisca and Valeria were forced to make pagan sacrifices publicly, as proof that the imperial family was above any faith. There was something deeply disturbing about that moment. When those in power decide that faith is an enemy, they begin by attacking those closest to them. The decrees arrived in waves in the provinces, first to the larger cities, then to the military posts on the borders. The summer of 133 was a time of forced choices throughout the empire. Bishops were arrested, communities dispersed. Christian soldiers were summoned one by one before their superiors, and urged to demonstrate loyalty to the emperor. How many people today face similar pressure, that of denying what they believe in order to maintain what they have built? Expedito's story also speaks to them. In Melitene, winter arrived early that year. The wind descended from the mountains with a different kind of chill, and every Christian in that fortified city knew that the approaching storm was not one of snow. Iron Age. The summons formally arrived at the Melitene barracks a few days before April 19th. An imperial messenger delivered the document following standard protocol, sealed, dated, and addressed to the commander of the 12th Legion. The content was the same as what had reached dozens of other commanders throughout the empire in the preceding weeks. The language was precise, leaving no room for interpretation. A date was set. A choice was given. Only one answer was accepted. Expedito read the document. He folded it. He placed it on the stone table in his office, and he remained silent for a long time. In the days that followed, 5 men appeared at his door, one at a time, without anyone having summoned them. 5 companions who had received the same summons, who had the same number of days counted, and who had come to the same conclusion. Hermogenes was the first, the scarred soldier who, months before, had answered that simple question with a phrase that Expedito had not been able to forget. Then came Caius, a young, light-eyed officer who had converted after hearing Expedito speak about Christ. Aristonus, who had served in that legion for over 20 years and knew the stones of Melitene as well as he knew his own face. Rufus, the son of a veteran, who had a wife and 2 young children waiting in a village 2 days' march away. And Galatians, the oldest of the 6, who had participated in more battles than he could count, and who looked at death with the tranquility of one who had already faced it many times from afar. 6 men, 6 different stories, one same choice. What each of them would lose by saying no was concrete and immense. Their position, imperial protection, possessions, family security, their lives. These were not abstractions. They were realities they knew well, realities they had built up over years of dedication and sacrifice. And yet, in the days that passed between the summons and the appointed date, none of the 6 wavered. There was no forced heroism in those days. There was something simpler and deeper. The certainty that renouncing Christ would be renouncing the only thing that had given true meaning to their lives. Expedito had spent decades being efficient, powerful, respected. And he had come to the conclusion, with the straightforward clarity of someone who always knew how to make decisions, that none of that came close to what he had found when he first said, Hodie. He was not choosing death. I was choosing not to deny life. On the night before April 19th, the 6 men prayed together in the Melitene barracks, their voices low and their hearts firm, while the mountain wind raged outside as it always had, indifferent to what men decide, indifferent to the small and enormous magnitude of the choices that change the world. April 19th of the year 303 arrived with a cold morning and a leaden sky over Melitene. The 6 men were brought before the imperial officers inside the headquarters, the same room, the same torches, the same weight of Rome's absolute power concentrated in a scroll with a red seal. The demand was repeated one last time. Each man's answer was the same no. Expedito stood before the men who had come to intimidate him, and with the same voice with which he had commanded battles, said what was in his heart, that he had found the true Christ, that there was no power in the world worth more than this truth, and that he was ready for whatever came. Hermogenes, Caius, Aristonius, Rufus, and Galatians stood by his side. Each, in their own way, bore witness to the same faith with the same steadfastness. The witnesses present at that moment, soldiers, auxiliaries, barrack servants, saw something they did not expect to see. Not terror, not despair, but a serenity that defied human explanation. Men who should have been afraid were at peace. And this peace was more disconcerting to the imperial officers than any armed resistance could have been. On that same day, April 19th, 1333, the 6 men were martyred by imperial order in Melitene. They gave their lives for Christ with the firmness of those who had made the most important decision long before that moment. Expedito's body was never found. Pious hands must have buried him in a place now unknown. wrote one of the first Christian biographers to study his story centuries later. But the name was not lost. The earliest Christian writers who recorded the martyrs of that persecution included Expeditus and his 5 companions in the list of those who had shed blood for the faith in Melitene that April. The Roman Martyrology, the Church's official record of the names and dates of martyrs compiled over centuries, preserved April 19th as Expeditus's day, not because of an imperial document, not because of a battle won, but because 6 men said no when the whole world expected them to say yes. The cult began right there, in that fortified city where the Euphrates still flowed cold and the wind still descended from the Armenian mountains. The soldiers of the 12th Legion who had witnessed that moment did not forget. They spoke to others who spoke to others. The Christians of Melitene began to invoke the name of Expedito in moments when they needed courage to act, to decide, to not postpone what needed to be done. The word he had shouted when he stepped on the crow continued to echo. Today. And no one else in Melitene needed to ask what she meant. From Armenia, Expedito's name traveled. Not in official documents or imperial proclamations, it traveled in the way faith always traveled in the first centuries. By word of mouth, from city to city, carried by merchants, by soldiers who had changed posts, by pilgrims who passed through Melitene and heard the story of that commander who had chosen Christ without hesitation. In the 8th century, more than 400 years after his martyrdom, there were Christian communities in Germania and Sicily that already celebrated the name of Expeditus and invoked him in times of urgent need. Something about that story resonated in a particular way. It wasn't just the story of one martyr. There were so many martyrs. It was the story of a man who had won the greatest internal battle that exists, the battle against procrastination, against cras, against the voice that always says the right moment hasn't arrived yet. In 1781, the city of Aciriale in Sicily, a coastal city overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, with the shadow of Mount Etna in the background, declared Expedito its official patron saint. From there, devotion spread with a speed that surprised even those who observed it closely. Italy, Spain, France, Belgium, in each country, in each culture, people found in the story of Expedito a mirror of their own internal struggles. With the colonists, the name of Expedito crossed the ocean and arrived in America. In the cities of the New World, on farms, in ports, in villages, the image of the Roman soldier with the cross and the word Hodie found devotees who had never heard of Melitene, but who immediately recognized that raven under the saint's right foot. Because everyone knows the crow. Everyone knows that voice that croaks inside us when faced with a difficult choice. Later, sometime later, when there's more time, when the risk is lower, when conditions are perfect. Crash, crash, crash. And that is why Expeditus, a 4th century commander of a fortified city that most people wouldn't know how to find on a map, remains one of the most invoked saints in the world, centuries after he stepped on that raven and shouted Hodie on a cold Armenian morning. Not because he was extraordinary before grace, but because he was ordinary like all of us, a man who procrastinated, who resisted, who had excellent reasons for not deciding yet, and who one day decided that the moment was right. You began this story seeing a man facing the most difficult choice of his life. Now you know the whole journey, from the Melitene barracks to chapels all over the world. From the word he shouted to the raven to the word that echoes whenever someone decides to act today and not tomorrow. The cross is still in his hand. The word is still engraved. Today.